Welcome to the 8th session of our Sustainable Infrastructure, Putting Principles into Practice. We are today looking at our 7th principle. Claire, can you move to the next slide? Actually, go on to the next slide. So before we begin, just wanted to acknowledge our host organizations. Next slide. And provide a few rules for the road. First of all, this session is being recorded and your attendance is consent to be recorded. And please mute yourself during the session. You'll have a time later to ask questions. In the last 15 minutes of the informal session will be open mic. Please rename yourself, like I put Duke at the end of mine. There are 3 dots at the upper right hand of your square. Tell us what your affiliation is. Please use the chat function if you have any technical issues. We will be keeping a close eye. But also, if during any of the presentations you have questions you would like answered, please go ahead and put them at any time in the chat function. At the end of this session, we will provide a link for a post-session survey, and we really appreciate anybody taking the time to answer this. It really helps us get feedback and improve future sessions. Anybody who fills this in will automatically receive a formal certificate of attendance. And finally, in the next couple days, we will send you an email with a link to this recording, as well as any of the resources that were mentioned during the discussions, during the presentations. So you don't need to worry about copying those links. We will send them to you in the follow-up. And that also will have the links to the previous sessions as well. Okay, so as every session, we like to have an interactive element to our webinars. And so if you'll notice in the chat, there's a link to a Mentimeter poll where we want to collect some feedback from you. So we're going to start just with a very simple 2 questions. There's the link in the chat. Claire, can you put up the 2 questions, please? Oop, we lost that. Anyway, the first question is where you are, and the second is what you do. And if you could just take a moment to fill in that those questions. So back to the slides, please. Oh, here we go. So just we're just getting some quick feedback here, and you can see that engineers, like most weeks, we seem to have a lot of engineers in this group, which is great, but also folks from the conservation world, scientists, development experts, people in planning, economists, risk management. And then where are people coming from? Let's look at the next slide. Where are you in the world? Oh, Washington, D.C. We've got folks from France and Switzerland, Netherlands, several different places in the US and Europe, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. We often have a bunch of folks that like to join us from Myanmar. So that's great. So we're going to come back and ask some questions later in the Mentimeter. But so today's session, if we could get back to the slides, please. So today, as I said, we are on the, the objectives of this webinar are, first of all, to exchange knowledge with each other, and that is during this session, but also we are putting very short case study briefs after each one for each one of the case studies. Several of these have already been put up at this website from the first few principles, and we will soon be adding quite a few more of those case studies, including from today's case study in Laos. Second of all, we like to have an interactive forum where both practitioners and specialists can exchange information and develop networks. And then finally, we are developing a community of practice across sustainable infrastructure, including our group LinkedIn site. So if you haven't joined that, please take a moment and join this LinkedIn site. So for today's webinar, we're down to the 7th principle, enhancing economic benefits. Next slide, please. And, not there yet. We are going to hear about our 7th principle from one of our co-hosts, Rowan Palmer from the UN Environment. So Rowan, I think you'll be sharing your own slides and it's off to you.
Thanks. Actually, Claire, do you have my slide? Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Excellent. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. So here on the screen, you see all of the 10 principles that Liz mentioned. And as she said, today we're focusing on principle number 7 on enhancing economic benefits. For anybody that's interested in looking at the full document and the rest of the principles, we can put the link into the chat. Next slide, please, Claire. So yeah, principle 7 states that infrastructure should create employment, support local businesses, and build amenities that benefit communities, thereby maximizing and safeguarding its economic benefits. This principle is an important one because economic development is often the main driver of infrastructure investment, and anticipated economic benefits for the communities that infrastructure is being built in, or maybe even more generally for the taxpayers at large who might ultimately be footing the bill for a lot of infrastructure. The economic benefits are often a major part of the rationale used to secure the support of these different stakeholders for infrastructure projects. This principle is it's closely related and cuts across a lot of the other principles. In particular, principle 3 on comprehensive life cycle assessment of sustainability, which talks about trying to capture some of the social and environmental externalities into the economic cost benefit analysis for infrastructure projects. It's also highly relevant for principle 6 on equity, inclusiveness, and empowerment, because that relates to the distribution of these economic benefits. We'll see in the case presentation today about a dam project in Laos, which demonstrates some of these links between economic benefits and some of the other issues. But principle 7 itself is really focusing on these 3 measures that can help safeguard the economic benefits. Next slide, please, Claire. And so to unpack it a bit, the 3 key aspects the principle covers are, number 1, employment. So measures to maximize employment benefits should be included in the design and procurement strategies and processes for infrastructure where possible. Some examples of this include policies that could increase women's participation in the workforce, and these have proven economic benefits for the community and for the wider economy. This links to principle 6, and actually last month's session we saw a really good case study about a WASH program in India that targeted jobs for women from low-income households. Another example is the deployment of nature-based solutions that could help create jobs for local communities, and here there's a link with principle 4 on prioritizing nature-based solutions, and our colleagues from ILO, who will be presenting next, will go into a lot more detail about the employment outcomes from infrastructure investment. The second key aspect of this principle is involving local businesses, and particularly micro, small, and medium enterprises in infrastructure projects, because this can have a multiplier effect on the economic benefits for the local community. Another aspect here is developing infrastructure as part of growth pole or development corridor strategies can help stimulate economic growth by increasing competition, fostering innovation, exploiting synergies and linkages between different sectors and different industries. And then the third aspect of the principle is creating co-benefits. So planners should try and systematically seek opportunities to create environmental and social co-benefits from infrastructure development, which in turn can have themselves have economic benefits. This could be related to things like where infrastructure is located, the types of infrastructure solutions that are selected to deliver a given service. So I mentioned nature-based solutions already. And then the flip side of this is that the economic implications of environmental and social impacts should also be taken into consideration when assessing the potential economic benefits of infrastructure development. As I mentioned before, this kind of relates to principle 3 on assessing impacts across the life cycle. And the case study we'll see from Laos highlights some of the issues that can arise when some of these negative externalities or hidden costs are not accounted for and managed during the planning process. Next slide, please, Claire. And so just to situate this principle in the infrastructure life cycle, it really does apply fairly broadly across the whole life cycle, but there's a few phases where it's particularly relevant. The first is during the strategic planning and prioritization and project design phases, where we need to be thinking about what kind of amenities and services we need and how they can be delivered in ways that maximize the economic benefits and the co-benefits for communities. And here, understanding the real demand for services is particularly important, especially if the economic rationale for the investment includes some kind of cost recovery from users. And I'm sure we've all probably come across examples in the news where some form of infrastructure, a toll road or an airport or something like this has been built and doesn't end up generating the revenue it was expected to because people aren't using it. The principle is also extremely relevant for the construction, operations, and maintenance phases, because that's when a lot of the employment benefits and the benefits for local businesses are actually realized. And then this links back to the procurement phase as well, because that's the time, to embed things into the contracts, such as requirements for the use of local labor, local suppliers, local services, things like that. So this is, just a quick overview of the principle. I'll end here. Up next, we have colleagues from ILO who will be presenting on the employment aspects of infrastructure development. Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song is a senior employment specialist at the ILO, and his colleague Ralf Kruger is the chief technical advisor for employment impact assessments and targeting at the ILO. And just a quick note that following their presentation, our colleague Savina Carluccio will be taking over, and she is the program director for the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure and one of our co-hosts today. And just very quickly before I hand over to Maikel, just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat as we go, and then we can collect and ask them afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rowan, and also good morning or evening or afternoon to everybody from my side. As Rowan mentioned, Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song. I work with the International Labour Organization in Geneva. I'm going to present this session together with my colleague, Ralf Kruger. It's a very short session, and we're going to do it jointly. So I'm going to start off and then pass to Ralf, who will then pass back to me. So let me just share my screen. In the meantime, thanks to Rowan for introducing this principle, which I'll pick it up from there. So let me see here. It's usually, so is this working? Everybody can see this, I hope. Great. Okay, so this is all already covered. So I'm going to go on to the next slide right away. Yeah, so I think maybe to just follow up on what Rowan was saying, clearly the economic benefits are often the main driver for infrastructure, and they are quantified in many different ways, but often, for example, in energy, it's looking at lowering energy cost, of increasing access to energy, and with transport investments, it also often relates to the benefit is really lowering transport costs, so that people or sectors or enterprises that use transport can be more competitive, etc. But the creation of employment in of itself is often also an important benefit. It's often highlighted very strongly in the phases when projects are being initiated, and these projects, often articulated that these projects will create jobs, often for people close to the infrastructure. But our experience is that despite that, they're often not really quantified, or not quantified in a very rigorous manner, and often also not incorporated into the appraisal. And I think it's important there that jobs, of course, in appraisal, often we see cost-benefit analysis, and then the benefits are quantified in monetary terms. And part of the challenge here is that jobs are often also difficult to quantify into monetary terms, so they don't often enter the equation of costs and benefits in that sense. So this is one of the issues that we're trying to respond to with this work we're doing on employment impact assessment. Now, the final point here is that really job creation is really an important mechanism through which the local population can benefit from the investment, and through that increase the buy-in, especially if the investment also imposes various costs on the local population, be it they may be displaced, or there's some it takes up space, or it creates some kind of pollution or whatever. Then I think that being sure that the local population also is able to benefit quite directly from the investments, and jobs is often the most direct way in which they can benefit. Thinking about that and trying to make sure that happens is quite important. Before passing it to Ralf, I think that the final point I want to make is that I think that didn't come out as clearly in terms of how the principle is articulated in terms of jobs, is that not only is it the number of jobs is important, but also the quality of jobs that are being created is an important aspect to consider. And so it's important to not only say, well, how many people will benefit, but also that we get a sense of what kind of jobs, what qualities, what salary, what conditions, etc., are related to these jobs. So that should factor into the equation. So. And with that, I'm going to then pass on to Ralf, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about employment impact assessments, which is one way of looking at these employment benefits. Ralf, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Maikel, and welcome also to everybody from my side. As already mentioned by Rowan, I'm working actually as Chief Technical Advisor, which in ILO speak is actually just another name for project manager on a project that does exactly this. So we do employment impact assessments of mostly infrastructure projects, and therefore actually what we are doing is just trying to measure the number of jobs created and the impact on quality of those jobs or of other jobs that may result from any project, also from infrastructure. So what I'm going to share with you are 3 points that I would like you to take away from the part of the presentation that I will give. One is the purpose. Why would you actually do the employment impact assessment we're talking about? The second one is to describe a little bit categories of what we are looking at when we do them. So actually, what are the employment impacts that we're looking at? And the third one then is to talk a little bit about the methodologies. Again, there's a lot more detail that could be shared, but that doesn't fit this time frame. So happy to follow up with anybody individually afterwards if you didn't get your question answered. Starting with the first point, purpose. So obviously, you don't just spend money on assessing employment impacts for nothing. So the two main purposes are either you want to inform decisions, and this could be either at the ex-ante stage, where basically you're preparing a project and you take this into account when you decide on it, whether you to fund it or to implement it, or you want to inform projects that will come later. So you generate lessons basically from ongoing or past projects. Secondly, as Maikel mentioned, you have a lot of arguments at the beginning that this and that project will create X number of jobs. And then afterwards, that idea is put to the files. So actually, we do such assessments to monitor and evaluate ongoing and past interventions to see if they actually delivered on what was promised. When we do this, and this now goes to the second point, and I'd like to use the example of a road project. So we're constructing a road, as here you see on the screen. There are 4 different categories you can define. This is one taxonomy sort of that is very often used. It's not the only one, but I think you will find it if you look at employment impacts of projects often. First of all, you have the direct effects. So what the workers employed by the construction company itself to implement the road. Second are indirect effects. So the companies that produce the stones, the inputs basically into the construction activity, but that is not within the company that constructs the road itself. So it's basically the supply chain, if you want. And then finally, you have induced effects also on the short term, all of this still during the construction phase. And the induced effects come about by wages and salaries being paid to workers and staff of these companies that either are part of the direct effects or indirect effects. So these induced effects are sort of clearly multiplier effect that you see, and we call them consumption effects here. I said all of this is short term. It's practically the construction period in the case of the road. And then you have the long term. And the long term obviously is what you build the infrastructure for. So in the case of a road, it's the infrastructure service that that road delivers. The effects on farmers being able to send produce to the market, maybe at all or at a lower cost. In any case, you have these infrastructure services that enable additional employment creation with other actors. Normally, the operation and maintenance of the road is really marginal in terms of employment creation, but of course, it's also counted. Now, this is what we're looking at. And Maikel, if you go to the next slide, I'll just very briefly mention some of the methods that we're employing. Of course, you do an in-depth assessment, therefore you will look at, particularly during the construction phase, of how many people are employed there, what are the conditions, because all of these effects that I just mentioned, they also have the qualitative dimension. As Maikel mentioned, I'm referring mostly here to the quantitative side, but there's always the other side of the coin as well, and it's equally important actually. So we would, and I label in-depth assessment here as basically a very descriptive exercise. You do go out, you do some surveys, you collect information from the companies building the road, and you would then basically have a detailed picture of at least how the construction looks like in terms of employment creation. In terms of the indirect and induced effects, most of this is actually derived from multipliers. So you use input-output tables or social accounting matrices. This is what these acronyms here stand for. And it's a macroeconomic exercise, which of course doesn't give you exact figures. It just gives you an idea about the employment potential, because there are lots of assumptions behind it. And if you do this, you need to be very well aware of this and the huge disclaimer with which these multipliers come. In terms of the longer term picture, what we do, and there are other methods as well, but I think these two that we have here are particularly important. One is modeling. So it's sort of a more sophisticated version compared to the multipliers. You would actually do a full macroeconomic model that can do lots of things, and you will have the trade-off between being more precise and actually having the data to feed them, but this is what you can use to then generate, again, estimates. So again, lots of qualifications to this method. And that's the more, let's say, traditional one. One that we are also employing is to use geospatial information systems methods. So basically, what you can create from geospatial information are indicators that you can use in, let's say, more standard econometric approaches. You can feed the time to market of a farmer that the farmer needs to reach from wherever he is to the next town, to the next marketplace, and things like this that give you an idea about transport cost. So just to give you an example. So these are methods we're employing, and as I said, happy to follow up with you individually if you're interested in any of these methods. And Maikel is also going to share a few resources. Back to you, Maikel.
All right, thanks, Ralf. If I can get this to move. Yes, here we are. So I think I just want to, as we close off, kind of share a little bit in terms of how we approach usually. So one thing is to measure the employment potential of a project, and the other is like, what are the points at which you can intervene to improve the employment outcomes of a project. And so this really is similar to what Ralf said. It maps out the different effects we have in infrastructure investment. So if we increase infrastructure investment, the first thing we tend to do is we increase the output of the construction sector. And here, I think one area where one leverage point that Rowan already mentioned is that in the procurement process, we can start influencing the employment outcomes. For instance, in terms of the size of the project will influence on the size of the firms, whether international or national firms are qualified to be part of the process, etc. So there are a number of issues in the procurement side which can start influencing the employment outcomes. In terms of the increased demand for construction sector inputs, which drives the indirect effect, here I think the essential part is the local content. So if there's more local content into the project, generally we see more local employment being created. If there's more imported content, typically the jobs to produce those inputs are created in another country. So managing or influencing the local content is another means through which we can increase the employment effect. Then in terms of the direct effects, in terms of the actual construction process, one thing we do a lot at ILO is to say, where can you use more labor intensive methods, which essentially means you increase the labor content and you offer jobs to part of the local population or people in that area so that more of those people can be employed. Of course, we make sure that this remains competitive. You don't necessarily increase the cost, but there's a lot of experience with specific activities which can quite easily be done, and where one can use more local, a higher share of the local population, provide a higher share of the project cost as wages versus other costs of the project. And then finally, there's links to the procurement side, but I think what is also important is on the qualitative side, is that at least for the direct effects, because this is where the project can quite easily influence the quality of employment, is that the requirements for minimum standards and working conditions are part of the contract and are also adhered to and monitored in the implementation, so that you have improvements in terms of work quality, in terms of occupational safety and health, but also that workers have access to Social Security or any other benefits that are part of improving the quality of employment, but are also part of the kind of legal framework in whatever country the project is being implemented. So these are kind of 4 entry points where we have seen that one can influence the employment outcomes, whether qualitatively or qualitatively, and the employment impact assessment process can help identify those entry points and which ones of these you would want to pursue. You may not want to pursue all of them, but which ones can help give you the bigger benefits in terms of enhancing the employment outcomes. So that's really it. I want to leave you really with, there are some references here. which we have. The first two are ILO reference guides, which are available online, which one can see and look and provide some inputs on methods as well. Then there are two which are external. One is from the AUDA, that's the African Union, and the other one is the joint impact model was developed by a number of financial institutions together. And it also allows for modeling in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, the last link is to the project that Ralf manages, the Strengthen 2 project, where you will find additional resources and notes and methods, etc. as well. So that's really it from our side. I'm gonna stop sharing now, and I'm not sure, I'm handing back to, is it Rowan or Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you, Maikel, and thank you.
Sorry, to Sabina.
Thank you for a very clear and very informative presentation. So what we're going to do now, we're going to do another round of Menti poll. So in a moment, we should just get on the screen the questions that we will ask, and then in the chat, there's a link to the Menti survey that you can click onto and then go to the questions. Claire, you sharing your screen? Excellent. Poll 2, which is the one. And so the questions that we're asking, which we were not able to see on the screen, but the first one is, in your experience, infrastructure projects have the greatest impact on employment through direct effects, indirect effects, induced effects, or long-term effects. So that we've heard about the different types of effects from the presentation just now in a very clear way. So, and I can see lots of people are already participating to the poll, and there seems to be well, a clear, well, not that much clear, you know, which is it's a competition between direct effects and long-term effect in terms of what has the greatest impact on employment. So yeah, now there seems to be, you know, like a quite a competition between these two types of effects. So perhaps we can move on to the next. So it's a slightly different question. So in your experience, how often is employment creations considered when decided on undertaking an infrastructure project? So the choice is between always, in the majority of cases, in the minority of cases, or never. So there seems to be no one thinks it's never considered, which is good. But I guess you started your presentation by saying sometimes it's a bit of a challenge, and it's certainly not done routinely. But the attendees today think in the majority of cases it is considered. So then we will move on to the next. I think it's the third and final question of this poll. So in your opinion, how important is it to consider the employment impacts of an infrastructure project in the appraisal process? So it is critical or very important. It's nice if possible, or not so important. So I'm pleased to see that no one thinks it's not so important, and the clear majority of people think it's very important, with some people think it's critical. Great. So that was a bit to test a bit the understanding from the presentation, and to just also get some views from attendees based on their experience or opinion. So I think we can now move on to a Q&A session, and I have a few questions here that I'd like to ask. So I'm going to address it to you both, and I guess you decide who takes it. So I'm going to start with a question that is around the employment impact assessment that ILO does. So do ILO impact assessments measure indirect and induced effects only in host countries or globally? That's a kind of a bit of a detailed question. So who wants to?
Okay, let me just take it. In principle, in the host country.
Okay.
Not globally. Because otherwise you're getting into too many, in a causality chain that's just too long and too vague, and you're getting into all sorts of discussions. So it of course depends a bit on the methodology. So in the case of what we do when we try to estimate the employment potential, because again, that falls into that category of the multipliers mostly for the short run effects. So that is, of course, it's an estimation. And you have to limit the model somehow. And the entity is normally the country that you use. Of course, in the long-term consideration, then it's a country model that you use. It depends slightly. There are regional projects where we would potentially do a regional model, which exists as well. So that depends for that one.
Okay.
Maybe if I can complement that point, I think that often the question, the interest is really from the host country, because I think that's where the project is, and the question is, will job be created for the people who are using or close to the road? And I think the country is not really interested whether jobs were created in a country far away who managed to produce construction equipment. That's often not the kind of political interest, so to speak. So from a kind of political side, is usually the host country and jobs created in the host country. That's the primary interest in the process. Yeah.
Thanks. So another question that I've got here is this one. So can a developer get an off-the-shelf software to carry out assessments, or do you need skilled consultants to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no off-the-shelf software as such. I think that's hard to find. I mean, the links to what we have provided, there are some models which deal with, so for instance, the PIDA model focuses on Africa, and one is able to model to some extent the job impacts of the countries there. I mean, sometimes there's not data for every country in Africa sometimes, so there's some imputation and stuff. But at the same time, it does require also considerable thinking through of what to put into the model. As with all models.
Right. Hopefully. But then on your point then, and since you're talking about data availability, which is always a challenge every time you do assessments. So do you need a lot of data available? I mean, can you still make an assessment with like kind of low availability, or so what's the I suppose, to be able to actually do a kind of a credible assessment, like, do you need a lot of data?
I think, the data that's really drives, in most of them, the national data is there. So either it's there or it's not. So there's not much to add. But I think that the data that really drives the credibility to some extent is the project type data, that is, which project developers do have access to, but one needs to understand, for instance, of the cost of the project, what are they going to be the imported parts, and what are going to be the domestically produced inputs of the project, and that needs to, and the model would require that is to get it right, is to try and input that accordingly. And if that is not right, or an overall cost, etc. So it's very, in these models, often very driven by the nature of the project inputs that one is able to provide, given that, yes, and then the kind of broader data limitations are there. And in some countries, if there's no accurate labor data or employment data, then that's what you have to live with. But that, of course, one has to take that into account, that for this country, their assumptions were made about employment data, and etc.
To add to that one, actually, it's surprising how much data is actually available at the national level. So, it's working on, let's say, economic issues globally for a while. I was surprised how much data is actually available, so that you would get more differentiated estimates, because we're still talking about estimates the whole time, actually, right now. So it is surprising. And then you still have countries where you didn't expect it. And the latest we came across was Kenya, where this labor force data is almost non-existent, at least in the form that we're normally used to. While other countries at even lower levels of income have it. And so let's say it's actually not so bad from my personal opinion. Thanks, back to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you again, both of you, for this very good presentation of all the references. It's time now to move on to the case study presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kanokwan Monorom, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social Science at Ubon Ratchathani University in Thailand. She will be giving a slightly different take on this principle, particularly focusing on the creating co-benefits element of it. Over to you, Kanokwan.
Thank you very much for a very nice introduction. I would like to share my slide. I think this one. Okay, I hope everyone can see. Okay, so my case study is about the Nam Theun 2. It's a dam located in Laos country. It's not very far from Mekong mainstream. This is the first.
You muted yourself, Kanokwan, sorry. Yep.
Sorry, okay. Okay, hi. Good evening from Thailand. This is Kanokwan. I'm going to present the case study called the Nam Theun 2 dam located in Laos countries, not very far from the Mekong. The dams located in the tributary of the Mekong mainstream called Nam Theun River. And also the impacts of the dams also goes to the tributary small rivers of the Nam Theun River as well. So I did the research in early 2014 with professor from University of Wisconsin Madison and independent NGO, Bruce Shoemaker. Okay, next slide. So I would like to provide all of you the background of the dam. The dam is the very largest dam at that time. It's more than 1,000 megawatts. A lot of budget came from different European banks and also from the ADB, and World Bank was acting a key role as a deal maker to invite people, the financier to put the money to build the dam, and also the dams generate impacts not only on the Nam Theun River but also the tributary, as I said. But the justifications of the World Bank to support the dam is to alleviate poverty in Laos and also try to make the Nam Theun 2 the best model for other dams around the world, because they were setting up the state-of-the-art called social and environmental mechanisms and monitoring process through the panel of experts. Next. So before I go into detail, I would like to set the scenes about the Lao countries. As you know, in Lao countries, no independent media or even human rights issue could not be able to bring up in the public, and the farmer or the labor organizations do not exist. And let alone the civil society organizations being really controlled by the state, and people couldn't be able to question the government policy, particularly on development issue and hydropower issues. But at the same time, by the time I did the research, I found a lot of impacts generated by the dam that I'm going to show you. So before I talk about that, the World Bank issue or announce the benefits of the dams called economic benefits. They said since the dams operated in 2010, over 170 million US dollars in revenues were received by Lao government, and the Lao government allocate this money to support education and to alleviate poverty in Laos. For example, they set them about 39% for improving the education, and 14% to provide for health sector, and the rest would be provided for infrastructure like road construction and maintenance of the road, or repair of the road, and also for electrification in the rural area. And the World Bank also provide budgets to the resettled communities, at least 15 villages in the resettled areas, about 6,300 people being relocated to settle in the resettled area on the Nagai Plateau in Nam Theun province. And based on the World Bank estimates, they said a living standard of the people who be resettled improve a lot, particularly on health and education, and a lot of kids could be able to enroll in the school. The percentage increased from 13% to 94%. It's quite a lot. It's a big jump of the enrollment of the student. And people, almost 100% of the people said the projects made their livelihoods better than before, and almost 100% as well. They said they could be able to generate income, maybe double income from new job available in the resettlement area. And yeah, many people, percent of the household would saving increase from 70% in 2006 to 99% at this moment. But what the World Bank said is not really reflects on the ground. They do not include the hidden costs. When I did the survey, I found some things very, very interesting, particularly on the negative impacts of the dam on the tributary of the Nam Theun River, the so-called Se Bang Phai River. So because the social and environmental causes could be able to quantify, it's very hard to quantify by the World Bank, particularly social issue. What I'm going to say about those social issues. For example, we went to the field and we interviewed many people. So we went to more than 20 communities located along the Se Bang Phai rivers, and we reviewed the literature and we compare the study made 10 years ago. We found that 100,000 people, particularly indigenous people, suffer from the dam, and because of their farmlands flooded and their homelands also flooded, and particularly women. So I took the photo of her. She was collecting snails and shells, some aquatic animals in the tributary of the Nam Theun. She said she couldn't be able to find those aquatic animals anymore, or found them very little. These resources very important for her food, daily food, and also small income to feed the family. And she got chicken from the project, but couldn't be able to sustain because she killed chicken and then she consumed chickens. She couldn't be able to raise it because she couldn't get enough money to buy the feed for the chicken. And the company, the dam company also provided downstream compensation, but only one time payment, and they set the revolving fund in the village. But the revolving fund is very difficult for the poor people, particularly the indigenous people, to compensate for the fishery losses. They couldn't be able to borrow the fund. Even they provided up to $250 per family, but it's not direct giving to the poor. The poor have to borrow the money, but the poor said they couldn't be able to borrow because they're afraid that they have to pay back. How they could earn money to pay back with the interest? It's just one-time compensation. it's very risk because it's not very sustainable at all to the life of the project and to the life of the people over there. So the challenges I found 3 challenges. The first one, the technical and programmatic challenge, I call the independent assessment of the impacts, impact situation on the downstream should be able to made effectively and comprehensively. For example, for the downstream programs, much of the compensation due to the impacted villages came in the form of development schemes, some of which entail substantial risk and fail to benefit many of those mostly impacted by the Nam Theun too. For example, some villages will provide as a chicken, but those chickens either die of disease or were quickly sold or consumed due to the high cost of feed. And the concession agreement between Nam Theun II company and the government of Laos is for 25 years. But the downstream program was based on the assumption the single one-time development intervention. So this is not really reflecting what's going on the ground. So a lot of ongoing and cumulative impacts to livelihood that are the most serious negative legacy of the Nam Theun II that we found when we did the survey. For the second challenges about governance and the political challenges, I think even they said the grievance process, but the grievance process not very functioning. Many villagers report the fear of the areas. They couldn't be able to speak up against the project. Even they did not get didn't get fair compensations to recover their livelihood. So but the company said, okay, the project would work through the relevant government committee, and that the grievance mechanism would let the villager go from the village level to the district level and to solve their problems. Actually, when we did the research, we found no evidence of grievance process as an actual effective working mechanism at the village level at all. We went to more than 20 villages, but we did not find any grievance process at the village level. The third challenges in terms of financial and economic challenges, I think the private developers are not accountable for full cost of investment, particularly on economic and social and environmental risk. For example, they provide compensation for the loss of fishery, particularly on the downstream program that established the village revolving loan funds valued at $250 per family in the project village adjacent to the say Bang Phai River. But the money can only be borrowed for a limited number of productive activities, such as buying inputs for lowland rice cultivation. This is not very good for the highland inhabitants, for example, the indigenous people, and also for raising animal or aquaculture. The indigenous people, they don't have enough materials, or they don't have enough budget to do these kind of activities. And it's not very flexible. They couldn't be able to get the money right away. They have to borrow, but the way the people are borrowing the money is not very simple. It's very complicated, and also they have to pay back with interest, like 6% per year. So the lesson learned from this case study is that I think this case study, the Nam Theun II Dam case study, address a failure of compensation and grievance process. As I said, this compensation and grievance process need to be reviewed by the independent expert in order to ensure that the private developers are responsible for the full cost of mitigation and compensation. Lesson learned number 2, I think this can be made through the attempt. So the World Bank should attempt more to create the accountability to the grievance process. So they have to allow local people to give the voices by themselves, to provide safety zone for them to express their concern about the impacts. But this thing could be able to take place in Lao society, given the authoritarian state like Lao country. And the last point about the lesson learned is that it is premature and not warranted that because the World Bank trying to use the Nam Theun 2 as the model to justify their future support for building hydropower around the world. This is too early to conclude this way, because as we found on the ground, we found that economic benefits do not really reduce poverty, particularly in the remote areas for the indigenous peoples, women who've been dependent on natural resources as main food and main income, and also other environmental causes. So in order to meet the sustainable way, they need to revise the grievance process, the compensation process, and allow independent experts to come and assess what's going on the ground, particularly on the economic benefits of the hydropower like Nam Theun 2 Dam. Thank you very much. This is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Kanokwan. Can you stop sharing your slides, please? That was wonderful, really interesting. And I think for those of you who have been through the series for a while, you'll see that we really wanted to put a case study that has tried to really address a lot of the sustainability issues, but has fallen short in some areas, just really to dive into the complexity of trying to address this. Let me just ask you one or two quick questions, and then we're gonna discuss this and some other issues in breakout, and we will come back at that point, and at the end have some more time to talk with you as well as our ILO colleagues more directly. But before we do that, I just want to ask you, talk about this ideal of building an island of accountability. So, and you also talk about the private developers not being responsible for some of these hidden costs. Is the accountability with the government or with the private developers that you're thinking about?
I think both, because the Nam Theun 2 companies owned by the Lao government, owned by the generating authorities, electricity of Thailand as well, and the French company. So all of them have to take responsibility on accountability on the Nam Theun 2 Dam. So not just the government, but also the private sector, both in Laos and in Thailand, and the banker from Europe as well. They have to think about this. It's not one single organization have to take part of the accountability.
And speaking of government, clearly you pointed out that Laos authoritarian government and very closed society has contributed to this. Is it your sense that many of these elements put in place by the project would have succeeded in a country more open? Is that really or is a manifold problem?
I think compared to Thailand, because I'm working on Park Bang Dam, I could see the difference between a civil society who very active in Laos, so they even can slow the process of hydropower development in Thailand and in Laos, particularly Park Bang Dam. So I think with given the situation like Lao country, so the civil societies doesn't exist. Even they exist, but they try to do some other stuff, not the dam issues at all, or social movement at all. So it's very risky. So even myself went to the field, I couldn't be able to disclose myself who I am. I just went there as a traveler or visitors, and we just sometimes if I confident enough, I said our academics from Thailand, blah blah. So we try to hide ourselves, and the people couldn't be able to speak up if we said we are a researcher. So it's a kind of ethical issue as well. When we did the research, we afraid that they would be arrested because they got one example. My colleagues who show the photos of the people whom he talked with on the newspaper, and the government went to the village and talked with that person and arrested that person. It's very risky. So if the hydropower developed in Thailand and the civil society is quite strong, and then they could slow the process of EIA, even try to participate in the EIA process. That's my answer. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to have to, we're running short on time, and there's some interesting questions like what the World Bank could have done to make it successful, which I'd like you to think about and answer when we come back at the very end for the informal discussion. And people can also discuss their thoughts on this during the breakout. We have 2 questions. We're about to divide into breakout groups, and the presenters will be in the different groups, so you can also engage them during this. The 2 questions which we're going to put up on the screen now have to do with both of the presentations that we've heard. And while I'm waiting for these to come up on the screen, I want to remind everyone that there is a survey which we would really appreciate you filling out. We're going to put the link in just a moment, and you will get a certificate of attendance if you fill it out. And second of all, these breakout questions will also be in the Mentimeter, and we appreciate if people can just put in their short thoughts on each of these, either while you're in your breakout sessions or while we're coming back in just about 10 minutes. So the 2 questions are, in your experience, have the promised employment benefits been realized on infrastructure projects that you are aware of in your own experience? And have these benefits balanced the environmental and social costs of the project? And then the second question specifically on this latter case study is, what lessons from this project, with its attempt to alleviate poverty and environmental concerns, and yet its failure to address many hidden costs, what can you apply, what lessons can apply to projects that you're familiar with? So with that, I am going to ask Sarah to break us into groups, and I look forward to seeing you all in a few minutes, 10 or so minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Please do take a moment to go back to the Mentimeter and just put in a couple of your thoughts about those questions or anything else that you've taken away. And we're going to just put up some of those comments in a moment. I want to remind you again, we're also going to put up in the chat the post-session survey. This is the formal end, right after we go through some of these notes that people have written in. I want to take a moment to really thank our 3 presenters, Kanokwan and Maikel and Ralf. Really interesting, important topic. They are going to stay on for the next 15 minutes for an informal discussion for anyone who can stay long. But before we wrap up and close out, I just want to, Claire, if you can make that scroll a little so that people can sort of see some of this. I think, at least in our session, it really resonated trying to think about this green jobs versus some of these other social issues, and how to measure that, but also portray that. Emily, who usually goes through this, is so good at pulling things out as it's scrolling. I'm just going to let each of you all take a look at this as it goes through, and we will provide some of this to folks. All of the information presented today, the tools and the access to the various publications will be sent to you as a reminder in a follow-up email in a couple of days. So we are now going to just go back to the slides to foreshadow next month's session, which is on financial sustainability. And we have two more excellent presenters. We're going to be hearing about a new tool that has recently been introduced to the market called Fast Infra and Sustainable Infrastructure Labeling, trying to help particularly the private sector identify what is a sustainable project, something we've been focused on for the last 8 weeks. And then we're going to hear a case presentation of another financial instrument called green bond issuance. And we're going to look at a very cool case study from Kenya that we're going to hear from the World Wildlife Fund, Jackson Kiplagat. So thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. And those of you who can stay on for the next 15 minutes, I am going to open up. If you have any ideas or questions you would like to pose, either raise your hand or just unmute yourself if there is a quiet moment, or put something in the chat and we will open it up. I'm going to take a moment to see if anybody puts their hand up. But in the meantime, we're going to go back to the question. Rend, I will let you, well, the question actually came from you. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rend, see if you asked the question, I think, or over to you.
Yeah, I had a specific question to Mrs. Monorom, who presented a very interesting case on Nam Theun Hydropower Project. Well, I have been following this project for quite a long period of time because we were a member of the independent World Bank panel. It was established more than 20 years ago. So we were involved in that period of time and we tried to keep on track with this project. I must say that for the last 5 years, I didn't hear any more type of news like you have been studying. So it's really very interesting. And I really know that the World Bank did their utmost best to make it a successful model. But now you have evaluated the impacts. And well, it seems that there have been some benefits, but also some disappointments. So, and of course, I am very much aware that the context in Laos is not very beneficial with a civil society, which is not very free to speak out and NGOs to take their role. So what could the World Bank have been done differently to make it more successful?
I think the World Bank have to, I agree that the World Bank set up the panel of expert POE. And also I'm so glad to know you're one of those because I'm following Teja Skader, who's an anthropologist, is part of the POE on this project. I think what the World Bank would have been doing, I think they should step back a little bit. So the downstream impacts wasn't included right from the beginning. Just because of compliance, because of the problems going on after the dams commission in 2010. So the impacts of downstreams are greatly witnessed by the local people, and particularly when they went there, just a few years after the downstream been impacted. But not many people mentioned about this until we went there, and then we posting, and then we wrote the article, or the peer review journal article, and we sent the letter to the banks in Europe as well. So we've submitted the paper to the banks in Europe in order to tell them what's going on, particularly on downstream impact. So I think if the World Bank would like to promote Nam Theun 2 as the best model for future hydropower, but in Africa or in developing countries, in Latin America, they should have a comprehensive social impact assessment covering not just the upstream but also the downstream areas. So they have to pay attention at the basin wide, not just particularly or small areas or limited area. They need to spend money on EIA, social impact assessment, health impact assessment, more and more in order to get comprehensive overall thorough data, information about sensitive issues, social issues, particularly the indigenous people, the marginalized people, the women. So it's very critical because the poor of the poor, they totally depend on natural resources for their daily life, small income. So this is the way bank should have the safeguard. They should strengthen their safeguard. They have the safeguard, right? So they should revise the safeguard and also put the principle into practice more and more. Not just the principle, not just let the country do whatever they like. They have to strengthen maybe force the country to follow the safeguard. I think this is the bank should have been doing this before they claim that this is the best model. Yeah, the Nam Theun 2 as the best model. Yeah, that's my point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your response.
Pallavi?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly throw out something I've been thinking about in terms of both, issues of scale where you are comparing watershed-wide impacts across, different sizes of watersheds, if you will, and how much, in the opinions of the speaker, does context help or not in from a governance standpoint, but also from a regulatory standpoint. And I just wanted to quickly give an example, say comparing a project, say in India, on the Indus or other larger watersheds to comparison in Boston on the Charles River. And because of scale, I feel like there is a lot of different nuances that have to be looked at from a governance and regulatory standpoint. So I was wondering if you could comment on, where there could be parallels that could be learned in terms of lessons learned that apply to both, or there are significant differences in trying to implement, say, dam restoration, dam building, but or dam removal from the governance and regulatory standpoint.
I think for the first one, governance, I think the most important entry point of hydropower is to get people involved right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So the Mekong, the MRC, Mekong River Commission, they set up the prior notification process and allow local people, local community from different basins who's going to be impacted by the dam, both downstream and upstream. They have to be consulted right from the beginning. They even have to speak out the scope of the study or the TOR of the EIA. They should be part of the EIA process. This is very accountable and very participatory. So I would like to pursue participatory social impact assessment, participatory environmental impact assessment. This is the first on governance issue. Particularly women, the marginalized people should be part of the EIA process. Okay, this is on the governance aspect. On the regulation, this is very challenging. The regulation, each country has different rules, different policy, different context, particularly in Laos. Like authoritarian state, no way you can do that. But if the Lao country would like to borrow the money from the World Bank again or the ADB again, they have to follow the rule of the World Bank, the safeguard or ADB safeguard. But China is so influential in Laos. So the Lao government always work with the Chinese government. So it's very difficult to implement the governance or accountabilities because it's like a bilateral agreement. So it's quite difficult and very challenging and regarding regulation. This is how I respond to your questions. Thank you very much. Very important questions.
Yeah. That is indeed. I just want to, before we run out of time, I did have a couple of questions on the employment issues. But let me just switch to that. And I see that Salil has a question. Is it on the employment or is it, I do want to pull that in as well. For the ILO folks?
Yeah, I had been participating while I was in Geneva in this discussion on sustainable infrastructure financing. So since then, off and on, I have been attending this. Thank you. But this question goes to the Thai professor. See, nowadays, these...
You know what, Celia, I'm going to just cut you off there and let you go ahead and directly discuss, because I wanted to pull Ralf and Maikel for just a minute.
No problem.
But feel free to communicate in the chat with that question. Going back to the employment assessments, there you mentioned that ILO helps do them at the initiation of a project, but also monitoring. And I'm wondering if you all have information, data on how accurate those initial set assessments turn out to have been, and if there's certain types of projects that are quite easy to accurately assess their employment impact of direct, indirect, induced, long-term, versus others where it turns out, for whatever reason, it's very difficult. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the accuracy of these assessments.
I have to go in a few minutes, so I can, but let me try before I jump out, and Ralf can maybe if. But
we're going to wrap up in just a couple minutes.
Yes, no, I think the monitoring, it gets quite tricky. The further in time and in space kind of you get from the project. So the kind of direct and the construction, that's kind of relatively straightforward. The indirect gets more complex, induced even more, and the long term, 10 years from the line, is actually something that's quite tricky, and one has to really, I mean, partially also because the investment in it, not many projects one is able to go back 10 years later and verify whether some of the assumptions or some of the things that we had planned at the beginning actually took place. So I think that's that's kind of initial. I think that, and with that also the accuracy also is, I think the construction related jobs can be usually assessed relatively quite accurately, even though even there sometimes we see, and there's a few studies we did in the MENA countries where there was a kind of it seemed like an overestimation, but in the long term, I think that and maybe a final point on there is that, of course, the jobs, these projects don't exist in isolation, so the attribution question also comes in as 10 years down the line. A lot of things have changed in that space where the project is taking place, and it's not only that project, as additional projects have come along. In addition to road, there's also electricity that came 5 years later, etc. So there's a difficult attribution question as well for the long term to try and make sure to be able to say exactly what the long term effects are. So I think that's I'm not sure if it's a satisfactory answer.
Ralf, anything to answer?
Question, but I know we're almost to add. I have to.
No, maybe just to re-emphasize the point, there is no systematic chain of studies that does this. So actually, you will always only have sort of case studies that are not part of a large pool, that are almost standalone. If you look at these employment impact assessments, we're doing them now as was mentioned, this is an EU-funded project, so we're doing it for a number of EU-sponsored or co-sponsored projects. So there will be a series of assessments, but we have also not finished them yet. So in that sense, I cannot really tell you much more. Also where they're maybe less accurate. Maikel already mentioned that the construction phase, because if you're observing it, then that's pretty accurate anyway. If you're looking at the estimates beforehand, I guess it also depends on how much effort you actually put into to create the estimate, because most of the time this is a rule of thumb thing at best that is put in, because also employment, if you look at these large infrastructure projects and the development banks that probably do still the most rigorous assessments, at least some of them ex ante, employment is a category that's not so prominent on their radar, actually. This is slightly changing now, so more and more of them are actually paying more attention. So for instance, this gym model that we're presenting, even though this is also estimates, is already a step forward that they are actually paying attention to employment creation. But it's not something that is looked at in depth normally in the ex-ante assessments. So I have worked for one of the development banks at one point, and there also it was practically a figure supplied by the person requesting the financing. And yes, you can argue in terms of plausibility, but that's probably all. You're not going to check in depth if you're one of those institutions.
Well, this is obviously a fascinating topic all around. And I know here in the US, with a focus on the new infrastructure bill, these issues are very prominent, all of them, the employment, job generation, but also all of the different social equity, environmental impacts. And hopefully we can continue this conversation amongst each other on our LinkedIn group if people have more sites or connecting with individuals. Thank you so much to the presenters today. Please fill out the post survey. We'll put the chat link the link in the chat one more time. And you can sign up now for next month's on financial instruments, which is another very important aspect of sustainable infrastructure. So thank you all, and we will see you again next month.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night from
Thanks,
Thailand.
Good night from Pakistan.
Good night. Good morning.
Good afternoon from the Netherlands.
Good night from Myanmar.
Small world.
Yeah.